In photographs of Europe before the wars, there is a detail most people never notice. You can see it in market squares, on narrow streets, in engravings of river towns and cathedral cities, windows standing open, shutters unlatched, people moving through stone corridors of air as if the whole city were listening for something. Not looking, listening. For centuries, that something was the bell. Not just its loudness, not just the hour, but a particular kind of sound-layered, irregular, physical that entered the body before it was understood by the mind. Old bells did not ring like clean musical notes. They carried a low hum beneath the strike, a shadow tone under the bronze, along with clashing upper voices that no modern loudspeaker would willingly imitate. They were not tidy instruments. They were local instruments, and that may be precisely why so many of them disappeared. The official story of Europe's silent towers is simple enough. Secularization, modern life, war damage, noise complaints, fewer worshippers, better clocks, better roads, better insulation. Each explanation is reasonable, each is true in part, but none of them fully explains why the sound of old cities changed so completely, why some places that still have bells no longer feel as if they do. Why records from the 19th and early 20th centuries speak of bell ringing as something dense, enveloping, almost atmospheric, while many surviving urban bells now sound thinner, higher, more disciplined, as if a rougher register had been trimmed away. It is tempting to call it superstition, or nostalgia. But then the archives begin to answer back. The medieval and early modern city was not merely seen, it was governed by sound. Bells marked work, curfew, fire, death, prayer, assembly, alarm, victory, execution, feast days, weather fear, civic mourning, political order. A person could live in a town and know its structure almost entirely by ear. One bell belonged to the guild church, another to the cathedral, another to the town hall, another to the convent over the hill. The city announced itself in overlapping bronze. This was not background noise. It was authority made audible. In England, the curfew bell had medieval roots, and in London the sound of Bow bells was strong enough to define belonging itself. In the Low Countries and parts of Germany, carillons in church towers created entire civic acoustics time translated into public vibration. Monasteries regulated devotion by bells. Markets opened under them. Armies feared them. Poets wrote about them because no one could avoid them. And bell founders understood, long before modern acoustics, that a bell was never one note. By the 17th century, musicians and founders were already studying the strange interior life of bronze. Jacob van Eyck, the blind Dutch musician, is often remembered alongside the Hemeny brothers, whose casting and tuning changed European bell-making. Their insight was simple but profound. A bell contains multiple tones at once. Later descriptions would speak of the hum note, the prime, the tierce, the quint, the nominal. The note people thought they heard. The strike note was not even a single physical frequency in the ordinary sense. It was a perception created by relationships between tones. That matters, because when people today talk loosely about the frequency of old bells, they usually imagine a single number, a lost tuning standard, perhaps some forbidden vibration. But historical bells were more mysterious than that. Their power came from combination. The low hum beneath the strike, the unstable overtone above it, the difference between what the bronze produced and what the ear assembled. In other words, the effect was never only pitch. It was texture, tension, weight, whole acoustic personality, and old bells were full of personality. Many historic bells were not correct by later scientific standards. Their hums could run sharp, their primes could sit flat, their upper partials pulled the perceived pitch in unexpected directions. Founders often worked by ear, adjusting bells not to an abstract chart, but to the way a whole peal felt together in air. Some scratched metal from the sound bow, some skirted the lip, some recast entirely. The result was not laboratory purity. It was a civic voice complex, sometimes unruly, often unforgettable. Then the modern world arrived and began to mistrust anything unruly. In the 19th century, bell tuning became more scientific. Founders increasingly measured partials, used forks and lathes, and pursued what later generations would call harmonic tuning. This was a technical achievement, and in many ways a beautiful one. Bells could be made more internally coherent, more musically legible, more standardized. Cathedrals and major churches commissioned grand new rings. Firms, such as John Taylor & Co., embodied this new precision. But precision also changes character. A harmonically tuned bell can sound noble, balanced, and clear. Yet compared with older bells, it can also sound less strange, less local, less haunted by its own metal. Some of the acoustic roughness that once gave bells bodily presence was softened in the name of order. What had once been an ecosystem of partials became, gradually, a managed sound. And still, even that was only the beginning. Because if modernity refined the bell, war mutilated it. In July of 1917, in the Rhineland-Palatinate town of Kusel, Deacon Karl Munzinger preached as his parish bells faced removal. He knew what was coming. The German state, desperate for metal, had decreed that bells would come down and be melted for war. He said they would speak a different language in the future. It is one of those rare surviving lines that lets us hear the emotional truth without translation. Bells that had marked births, funerals, Sabbath rest, and prayer would be recast as artillery. Bronze that had called people together would be used to tear them apart. Around 44% of German church bells were melted in the First World War. Across Europe, communities' watchtowers emptied. And it was not merely the loss of objects. People described it as the collapse of order itself. Bells had been the clock of daily life, the edge between labor and rest, the public sign that something larger than the individual existed. When they vanished, the silence was not neutral. It was interpretive. It meant a world had been interrupted. Some bells returned after the war. Many did not. Some parishes commissioned replacements. Others made do with smaller, cheaper, newer instruments. A city that had once spoken in one bronze dialect now spoke in another. Then came the second wound. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazi regime confiscated more than 175,000 bells from towers across Europe. Austria, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Yugoslavia, occupied territories to the east. The map of seizure spread with conquest. Bells were catalogued and graded. Some were spared for age or prestige. Most were not. They were hauled by rail and river to immense holding sites later remembered as Glockenfriedhöfe bell cemeteries. The phrase is almost unbearable in its accuracy. Bell cemeteries. Not metaphorical cemeteries, but actual yards where the voices of towns lay piled together, mute and waiting before being broken down into ingots. In Hamburg and elsewhere, bronze accumulated in monstrous quantities. The old civic vocabulary of Europe was reduced to supply. You can understand the material logic. Armies needed copper and tin. States always see metal before they see memory. But something else happened in those years, something harder to measure. The seizure of bells was a seizure of rhythm, of locality, of the right of a town to sound like itself. Occupation does not merely change laws, it changes what mourning feels like. And some communities knew this instinctively. They hid bells, buried them, delayed inventories, bargained, protected one small bell if they could not save the rest. Not because bronze was sacred in itself, but because a village without its bell was no longer fully legible to itself. After 1945, the rebuilding began. Towers were repaired. New bells were cast. International commissions tried to trace and repatriate what had been taken. In some places, lost bells were replaced by modern sets with clean harmonic profiles. In others, churches never recovered enough money, enough metal, enough certainty. Some towers stood empty for years. Some were fitted with electrified mechanisms that altered ringing practice. Some cities rebuilt around cars and concrete no longer gave bells the acoustic space they once commanded. This is where the deeper silence begins. Not silence as the complete absence of sound, silence as the loss of dominance. An old city did not need absolute quiet for bells to matter. It needed a hierarchy in which bells ranked above most other things. Hooves, carts, footsteps, vendors, doors, these created texture. But bells crowned the soundscape. Their waves traveled along stone, over tile, across water, through thin glass and open markets. They did not compete with the city. They organized it. Motor traffic changed that. Factories had already begun the transformation with whistles and mechanized time. Then engines filled the streets. Later came buses, ventilation systems, amplified music, insulated windows, zoning laws, aircraft, sirens, headphones. The city became louder but less shared. Noise increased while public listening collapsed, and church bells, once sovereign, became one sound among many then. In some places, one sound too many. By the late 20th century, the language around bells had shifted. What earlier centuries treated as necessary public signal was increasingly reframed as disturbance. Complaints multiplied. Night ringing was reduced or stopped. Curfews were imposed on curfew bells. Some municipalities negotiated limits by hour, day, or decibel. Bells survived but often as managed heritage rather than unquestioned civic fact. Officially, nothing sinister had happened. No decree announced that an old acoustic order should be removed from human life. Yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Recast the bells, standardize the tuning, melt the originals in wartime, rebuild selectively, electrify the mechanism, restrict the hours, fill the streets with engines, seal the windows, reclassify public sound as private nuisance, and then say the cities simply became modern. There is another layer to this story, quieter and more intimate. Imagine a woman in 1917 hearing the bell that marked her wedding taken down to be melted. Imagine a child in the 1950s growing up beneath a replacement bell that sounds similar enough to outsiders but wrong to every elder in the square. Imagine a sexton carrying the memory of a tower's old vibration in his body, unable to prove the difference to anyone who never heard it. Loss of sound is hard to archive. A missing building leaves rubble. A missing law leaves documents. But a missing timbre leaves testimony, and testimony is fragile. It sounds like sentiment. Yet communities have always recognized tonal identity. They know when a town hall clock has been retuned. They know when a dialect flattens. They know when a bell no longer spreads through stone the way it once did. What, then, was the frequency they removed? Not one number. Not one secret tone hidden by a cabal of acousticians. The evidence points somewhere more interesting and perhaps more unsettling. They removed the low, thick communal register of civic life, partly through technology, by replacing irregular old bells with cleaner harmonic ones, partly through war, by destroying the very bronze that had stored local memory, partly through bureaucracy, by converting shared sound into regulated noise, partly through urban change, by building cities in which no public voice can remain central for long, and partly through culture itself, which grew suspicious of anything that claimed the right to interrupt everyone at once. What disappeared was not just ringing. It was resonance with authority. The old bell was more than an instrument. It was an acoustic commons. It reminded rich and poor that they inhabited the same hour. It cut across walls. It marked grief publicly. It made worship unavoidable, yes, but also made danger unavoidable, celebration unavoidable, mortality unavoidable. It announced that time did not belong entirely to the individual. Modern life prefers customized signals, personal alarms, silent mode, tailored playlists, private notifications. In such a world, the old bell can seem almost offensive in its confidence. It assumes that a whole community should hear the same thing, at the same time, whether it asked to or not. And perhaps that is the final reason old cities fell silent, not because the towers vanished, not because every bell was destroyed, but because the civilization that once accepted shared interruption gave way to one that increasingly does not. Still, if you go out early enough in a Dutch town by a canal, in a French village after rain, in an English close before traffic fully rises, in a Central European square where stone still answers bronze, You can sometimes hear the older world surviving inside the newer one, not in perfect form, not whole, but in the way a bell's low hum arrives a fraction after the strike, in the way the air seems thicker for a moment, in the way people, even now, pause without meaning to. Something in the body remembers what the city once was, not just a place of buildings, but a field of shared vibration. And that may be why this story lingers, because silence is rarely just silence. Sometimes it is the record of a replacement, a note filed down, a tower emptied, a war paid for in bronze, a public voice reduced until only its outline remains. If you listen closely, old cities still tell on themselves. They tell you in the bells that are gone, and in the bells that remain but no longer carry the same weight. They tell you in the gap between official explanations and lived memory. They tell you that history is not only what people built, wrote, or fought over. It is also what they were once forced to hear together, and what they eventually stopped hearing at all. So the next time a bell crosses a street and dissolves into traffic, pause for a second before it disappears. Ask what tone used to travel beneath it. Ask what was melted, regulated, refined, or forgotten. And ask gently what else a city loses when its deepest voice is no longer allowed to ring.